Okay. Well, the story of snow sports and avalanches in the Northwest are bound together. I find that the longer I ski, the more conscious I am of how the sport has changed, and the more curious I become of how we got here. We've come to this workshop today to improve our knowledge and awareness of avalanche safety, and I hope that this brief look at the past might give us a clearer perspective on how that awareness has developed. Which button? This is it? That one, great. Okay, got it. All right. Most of the early records of avalanches in the Cascades appeared after the railroads arrived in the 1890s. Many of you may have heard of the Wellington disaster in 1910, when 2 trains near Stevens Pass were trapped for nearly a week in a storm. Accounts describe snowflakes the size of soda crackers that accumulated at up to a foot an hour before the storm turned to rain. A huge avalanche swept the trains down the embankment into the Ty River, killing 96 people. It remains the worst avalanche disaster in US history. These pictures show the wreckage of the trains and efforts to recover the victim. Just 3 days later, a similar disaster took place at Rogers Pass in Canada. 62 people were killed in an avalanche that seemed like an echo of Wellington. After both disasters, the railroads began drilling tunnels under the mountains, and at least a few people began searching for deeper lessons. '16 was another big snow year. On the first day of February, almost 22 inches of snow fell in Seattle, a record that still stands. The snow lasted for days, prompting a few residents to dust off their skis just to get around town. On Sunday, February 6th, a group of Norwegians staged a ski jumping exhibition on the north side of Queen Anne Hill in Seattle. It was the first time that this had ever happened, and for many in Seattle, it was their introduction to skiing. On the very same day, in fact, on the same page of the newspaper, came a warning about avalanches in the mountains. The warning was from Edward Beals, the US Weather Bureau forecaster in Portland, Oregon. Beals had been involved in forecasting during the 1910 Wellington disaster and had learned from that experience. A 2009 article in the Avalanche Review called this the first published avalanche warning in US history. So in the Northwest, skiing and avalanches have been linked since the beginning. But the lessons were slow to take hold. 20 years later, in 1936, avalanches near Snoqualmie Pass buried several vehicles and killed 3 people. Driver Harold Devereaux was rescued alive from this truck after being buried for 7 hours. It was after this event that the State Highway Department decided to build snow sheds at the pass. 3 years later, in 1939, 6 students from the Bellingham College were killed in an avalanche on Mount Baker. This accident took place in July, showing that avalanches could happen in any season. Well, at the beginning of World War II, units that would become the Army's 10th Mountain Division trained on Mount Rainier. The Army's mountain troops created a flood of inexpensive ski gear after the war, and a cadre of men enthusiastic about skiing. These men, and many women, became ski patrollers, instructors, and ski area builders throughout the West after the war. This picture's at Mount Baker. And as the ski resorts grew, the Forest Service realized that they owned a lot of avalanche paths that were being developed into ski runs. So they made a first tentative step to deal with this problem at one area, Alta in Utah, by hiring Monty Atwater to be America's first avalanche hunter in 1945. Ed LaChapelle joined Atwater in the winter of 1953. LaChapelle grew up in Tacoma, was active in the Tacoma Mountaineers, and graduated from the University of Puget Sound in physics and math. In this picture, Atwater is sitting on the left and LaChapelle on the right. And Lowell Thomas, a famous broadcast journalist, is lying in the snow. The dog is named PIF, P-I-F, which stood for Precipitation Intensity Factor. It was a metric that Atwater cooked up for predicting avalanche risk. Well, at the same time that LaChapelle joined Atwater in Utah, the Forest Service established avalanche research centers in the Colorado Rockies under Dick Stillman and in the Cascades at Stevens Pass under Frank Foto. Here, an assistant is recording measurements while Foto inspects snow layers using a RAM penetrometer. Foto served as both a snow ranger and an avalanche researcher. Here he's attaching a detonator to an explosive charge to knock down a snow cornice on Cowboy Mountain. The little arrow in the right-hand picture shows Foto's position on the ridge. During the winter of 1953, Frank Foto made a classic storm study at Stevens Pass, recording snowfall for 103 hours straight. He had no automated recording equipment, so he had to slog out into the storm every hour. Monty Atwater wrote that it was an exhibition of stamina unequaled in my experience. Over 11 feet of snow fell at rates as high as 5 inches an hour, but PIF was less than 1, and there were no avalanches. The National Ski Patrol had been active at ski areas since the late 1930s, but it wasn't until 1953 that mountaineers in Seattle established the Mountain Rescue Council, a search and rescue system combined with a safety education program. Only months after its formation, the council swung into action to rescue one of its own members, Bill Dagenhart, following an avalanche on Mount Snoqualmie. Dagenhart was president of the Mountaineers at that time and widely respected. In fact, after his death a few years later, a peak was named for him in the North Cascades. Well, as he thanked his friends during the rescue, they told him, "That's all right, Bill. Next time you'll be pulling one of these ropes." It's the idea of shared service that continues in volunteer search and rescue to this day. Well, the early Forest Service snow ranger programs were very successful. In the late 60s, Monty Atwater wrote, "After 20 years, there has yet to be a skier killed in the Western Hemisphere by an avalanche who was under the wing of an avalanche hunter, unless he made a mistake such as passing a closed area sign or the equivalent." In the Northwest at that time, avalanche work was done by the Highway Department, the Forest Service, and local ski patrols, but there was little coordination between them. And this began to change in the 1970s. In a region that had been hooked on lift skiing since World War II, the 70s saw a revival of cross-country, a branch of skiing that largely went out of style after the 1930s. This picture shows a citizens race near Gold Creek at Snoqualmie Pass in the 1970s. A few skiers started using cross-country gear for backcountry touring, like Gary Rose and Dave Chandler in this photo from Hurricane Ridge in 1972. But this emerging trend was not what changed the game of avalanche safety in the Northwest. Instead, it was the State Highway Department. In fact, one road in particular, the North Cascades Highway, which opened in the fall of 1972. Well, the Highway Department knew they were buying themselves a lot of avalanche problems in the North Cascades, so they hired Ed LaChapelle to help understand what they were dealing with. Since his work with Monty Atwater in Utah, LaChapelle had become one of the leading avalanche experts in the country, with an impressive body of professional work, but also books aimed at ski tours and other recreationists. Books like The ABC of Avalanche Safety, A Field Guide to Snow Crystals, and Secrets of the Snow. One of his best-known essays, a blend of philosophical and practical, is The Ascending Spiral, which was published in the Avalanche Review a couple years before his death in 2007. LaChapelle was also a glaciologist and a ski mountaineer, and in the 1950s had led a team studying the Blue Glacier on Mount Olympus, where this picture was taken. Although it looks like an X-ray taken by my dentist, this is actually a map of Avalanche Paths east of Washington Pass on the North Cascades Highway. LaChapelle produced an atlas of slide paths covering the entire length of the highway, making clear to the highway department what they were dealing with. At one point during the study, he brought some Japanese colleagues to Washington Pass to observe the avalanche problems. He pointed out how the hairpin turn below early winter spires gives slides 2 chances to hit the road, one on either side of the switchback. He later said, they looked around and saw how the road comes up the west side, goes down the east side, and then they shook their heads and said, we would tunnel. Following the North Cascades survey, the Highway Department hired LaChapelle to map avalanche paths on all the other mountain passes in Washington. His team did that in the mid-70s, producing 2 more thick reports. Here's a map of avalanche paths threatening the highway just west of Cowboy Mountain at Stevens Pass. As a result of this work, the Highway Department became more interested in snowfall and avalanche forecasting. They found that they could save a lot of money deploying highway crews if they had more accurate snowfall forecasts. And they started considering the possibility of centralized avalanche forecasting, launching a study guided by LaChapelle in the late 1970s. 2 of Ed's grad students at UW, Rich Marriott and Mark Moore, became key members of the study team. You can see they've commandeered that helicopter for the Department of Forest Service. They were joined during this 2-year study by Phil Taylor, who was a whiz at constructing instrumentation for remote weather stations. As part of the study, they installed weather stations at all the major Cascade passes, as well as at Crystal Mountain, Paradise on Mount Rainier, Hurricane Ridge, and Mission Ridge. These pictures show the weather station at Paradise. With help from Sue Ferguson, they've developed a systematic framework for avalanche forecasting based on snowpack stability, current weather, and projected weather, as outlined in this diagram. It was described at the time as an outstanding accomplishment, both for the project and for the science of avalanche forecasting as a whole. Although the study of central avalanche forecasting was started by the Highway Department, efforts to find a more permanent home for it centered in the Forest Service. To serve skiers and snowshoers at Snoqualmie Pass, Ken White at the North Bend office had for a few years been putting out avalanche information on a telephone recording at 442 Snow. Okay. This was years before the arrival of the web, and if you wanted to learn about snow conditions, you had to make a phone call and listen to a recorded tape. With the support of people like Ken White in North Bend and Roland Emetaz at the Forest Service office in Portland, the Northwest Avalanche Center was born, with Mark Moore and Rich Marriott as its first employees. Here's a picture of some of the early avalanche hunters taken in 1982. Kneeling on the left is Rich Marriott, and on the right, Ed LaChapelle. Standing on the left is Cindy Marriott, next to Richard Armstrong and Paul Bogger, a member of the Crystal Mountain Ski Patrol, and later the patrol's director. Paul is holding Oscar, the avalanche wiener, an elusive member of the snow science community. You'll have to ask Rich Marriott about him. Next to Paul Bogger is Pam Spears, one of the earliest NWAC forecasters, and Betsy Armstrong, who co-authored the Avalanche book with Knox Williams a few years later. And finally, leaning over the top of the van are Mark Moore on the left and Sue Ferguson. Sue Ferguson deserves special mention. One of the earliest forecasters with NWAC, she was responsible for launching the Avalanche Review, which started as a 8-page newsletter, but has grown into a folio-size, full-color, quarterly journal. That's a key connector for the avalanche community. Ferguson was also one of the founders of the American Avalanche Association, which any of you can join. One of the benefits of memberships is a subscription to the Avalanche Review. During the early years of NWAC, if you wanted to take an avalanche course, there weren't many available. Ken White of the Forest Service was doing free safety clinics on Saturday afternoons at Alpental. More intensive 2-day classes were offered by Ray Smutek, shown here, out of his mountain school in Renton. Smutek was a former engineer who started Off Belay magazine in the 1970s. He was also one of the earliest people I knew who wrote about heuristic traps in avalanche safety, though that term wasn't used back then. Smutek started offering avalanche courses around the same time that NWAC got started. I took a couple of classes from him, including this one at Paradise in 1980. A few years later, Mark Moore and Paul Bogger started offering classes through what they called the Northwest Avalanche Institute. I imagine that some of the clubs talked about avalanches as well, but I don't have any details of that. Ski guiding was virtually non-existent at that time. But that began to change around 1983 when Eric Sanford started Liberty Bell Alpine Tours, a company that offered helicopter skiing for the first time out of the Methow Valley. Today, North Cascades heli-skiing fills that role. Well, virtually nobody was interested in hiring a guide to go ski touring back then, but people would pay to go helicopter skiing. So Sanford offered guide training and snow safety classes like the one that my brother Carl took in 1984 when this picture was taken. And they brought in some great instructors. In this picture, the skier playing the victim is Ed LaChapelle himself. Gary Brill, shown here, started teaching avalanche classes in 1986, and he was one of the more active instructors in the Seattle area for several years. ARI, which established a nationally recognized program that's popular today, got started in the early 1990s. Well, it's only in the past 10 to 15 years that backcountry guiding has gained much traction in the Cascades. I think it has a lot to do with improvement in equipment, which has made the backcountry more attractive for skiers who weren't winter mountaineers already. Martin Volken has been a leader in the local guide community during that time. This picture shows Martin leading the first traverse of the Snoqualmie Haute Route in 1999, which was basically a scouting trip with an eye toward future guiding. Since then, the number of guides in the Cascades has grown pretty dramatically. With the phase-out of Forest Service snow rangers after the 1970s, ski patrols became the front line for avalanche control at Washington ski areas. Ski area avalanche patrols have gotten larger to meet the growing demand for access to untracked snow. They still use a lot of hand charges, which Monty Atwater described as tossing bombs like a newsboy delivering papers. And those tools have been augmented with bomb trams, and avalanchers, and gas-X exploders, and even helicopters when the conditions aren't safe for approaching dangerous slopes on foot. Ski patrols have also been educating skiers and snowboarders about unfamiliar winter hazards. Paul Bogger of the Crystal Mountain Patrol was especially active spreading the word about tree well safety. This was something that became more urgent as snowboards and wide skis made deep snow more accessible. The original reason for the Northwest Avalanche Center, highway avalanche control, is still vital, and key people for the highway department are often former ski patrollers. That's the case for John Stimbaris, the avalanche control supervisor for the South Central Cascades, who, like his predecessor, Craig Wilbur, started out patrolling at Alpental. The main line of defense on the Snoqualmie Pass Highway uses bicycle-driven bomb trams, like this one near Airplane Turn. But Stimbaris and his team also use artillery as needed. Their biggest control site, the former East Snowshed, is being neutralized by construction of a new highway bridge. At Stevens Pass, Mike Stanford, another former ski patroller, is avalanche supervisor for the North Central Cascades. This photo shows an M60 tank in use near the old Wellington avalanche site. More recently, that tank has been replaced by a howitzer. In spring, after the avalanche danger at Stevens Pass subsides, Stanford's team prepares the North Cascades Highway for its spring opening. In this picture, Alan Willard fires a howitzer from a point a few miles east of Washington Pass. Meanwhile, John Stimbaris and team head for Chinook Pass, which is usually the last mountain pass in Washington to open just before Memorial Day. This program is unique because it relies entirely on skiers to trigger avalanches, either by ski cutting or to deliver explosives. In this picture, Rob Gibson climbs above the heavy machinery clearing the road. In the fall of 1997, the Northwest Avalanche Center was on the verge of closing due to state budget cuts. Fortunately, a campaign by the Washington Ski Touring Club and others generated over 200 letters that prompted the governor to approve emergency funding. Well, this close call led to the creation of the Friends of NWAC in 1998. Today, it's the nonprofit arm of NWAC. The Friends have organized the Snow Bash and Snowball events, as well as the annual Vertfest shown here, as ways to strengthen the local backcountry community and raise funds to support the Avalanche Center. Although the Friends now organize this event, NSAW, it's worth remembering that Michael Jackson got it started almost single-handedly back in 2007. Well, with just 3 forecasters, Kenny Kramer, Dennis DeAmico, and Garth Thurber, who's handing off to Robert Hahn this year, NWAC maintains the largest network of remote weather stations of any avalanche program in America. By my count, there are 28 weather stations, but I've heard higher numbers, so I might have missed a few. This collage shows only half of the total. And every station is based on a cluster of sensors and wires and radio transceivers that need to be serviced every autumn, and sometimes in winter as well. Today, we can get that sensor data directly on the internet. No more need to call a phone number for a taped message. With support from the Friends, NWAC has hired a team of professional observers, mostly drawn from the growing guide community, and they provide high-quality field reports. And this is one of the most important additions since the center was founded. Well, I've enjoyed digging through this history to review how safety in the mountains has benefited from our growing community. But I want to close with something that Paul Bogger said to me as we talked on the phone a few days ago. Paul was as enthusiastic as anyone about all the resources we have today, but he circled back to a key point. It's that safety in the mountains depends ultimately on the decisions made by small parties. That means me and you and your next ski partner. And once we step out in the snow, I think that needs to be in the front of our minds. So with that thought, thanks for listening.